There is a variety of killers in the entity's realm, and as a result a big difference in their power levels. This means the entity has to balance them out by changing them. Some are weakened by the entity, and others are empowered. They all need to be at a relatively similar power level in order to make the trials fair. We'll take a look at all of them and assess how or if they were either nerfed or buffed by the entity, and for what possible reason. Hey everyone, and let's get into it. Starting out with the substantially nerfed, the characters who were greatly weakened by the entity in order to fit the trials. Vecna is maybe the most nerfed down out of any of the characters. Outside of the realm, he is a powerful wizard and lich, but has been stripped of a number of his abilities and left with just his 4 different spells in the realm. This isn't terrible, but he's definitely much weaker. We're even shown this visibly with a mark on his back, which indicates a restriction put on him by the entity. This is something we've never seen before, or something that has never been needed for other characters, showing that Vecna is probably an actual threat when he says he wants to overtake and destroy the entity. It's a case where the entity is making a very visible action to greatly nerf him, something I doubt he likes either. Freddy is another character who has gone through substantial nerfs. At the end of his lore it even mentions this, saying his powers are buffed in some ways but nerfed in others. The thing is, I'm not sure what was buffed. He mostly just seems nerfed to me. He's got far less control over the dream world, he's no longer essentially a god in it, but instead just a general slasher who can confuse the survivors a bit. It's really quite a substantial nerf. He's further damageable out of the dream world too, and is still vulnerable in the dream world to these things. To things like pallets. He's lost most of his autonomy over the dream world, with the entity nerfing it down and limiting it substantially. Sadako is another character who's gone from being able to instantly kill someone or curse them across 7 days and guarantee death to a sort of underpowered version of herself, restricted to in-trial TVs and a much weaker application of her curse with the 7-bar system. She doesn't really have much telekinetic ability anymore either, able to only use it for utility things like carrying. She's generally quite slow and incapable of causing much damage without first teleporting lots. Sadako seems quite substantially nerfed down from her pre-realm self. Dredge is definitely much weaker. When described in the lore, Dredge is like this overwhelming darkness that consumes all and covers everything when it's there. This happens sort of sometimes in the realm, kind of, with Nightfall, but it's much less deadly and scary than in the lore. Dredge as a whole in fact is now much smaller, and restricted to this tighter fog and form in order to fit the trials. Instead of being able to manifest anywhere, it can only go to lockers and stuff like that. Evil embodied, but restricted greatly to the trials and their rules. Moving on to greatly nerfed. Characters who are absolutely weaker but are not completely weakened. Nemesis doesn't quite have the supernatural and otherworldly powers of the substantially nerfed characters, but he is still greatly nerfed. The primary change is his lack of mutation. In the realm, his mutation extends to only his arm and tentacle, which can level up and slightly mutate up in tiers of 1 to 3. Compare this to how he mutates in Resident Evil 3 and it's quite a substantial difference. In DBD he barely even alters his physical form for the scenario. He's further nerfed by no longer having access to weaponry, such as his flamethrower or rocket launcher, and even his tentacle itself is much shorter and unable to grab, and only swing or slap down. This is a heavily nerfed Nemesis. Wesker is similar to Nemesis in that his mutation and general BOW abilities have been greatly nerfed down in the realm, leaving him just sort of a shadow of his former self. He can still do dashes, but he can't consistently move at a much faster speed like he could before. He can't mutate beyond his base Ouroboros tendril, and he's generally just a lot weaker. Cenobite may seem like the type to be substantially nerfed, however I think he retains enough power and enough freedom that he is only in greatly. He's still able to teleport to the box, use chains, and even teleport people out of the realm, which is quite a strong and a clear sign of trust from the entity. Sure, many of these abilities are greatly nerfed down to fit the trials, but not so nerfed I think that I would put him at the very bottom. Pyramid Head, despite receiving quite substantial nerfs to his power from the entity, did still get a lot in return for this. It might be because he made a deal with the entity, where others didn't. Whilst his overall power level as a being has been reduced it seems, to fit the trials, he is still buffed in a number of ways too. He has a number of new abilities that he couldn't do before, like his trails, cages, and ranged attack, so it's a weird one for him. However, I think due to his overall power level within the trials likely being quite heavily limited, then he is still down here despite his buffs. This may have been an agreed nerf though, part of the agreement Pyramid Head and the entity made together. Demogorgon has largely just been restricted quite heavily, with it no longer able to move in the way it usually would, and further greatly reduced in its defensive capability, and even making it vulnerable to flashlights. Demo in-game is far from the power of the demos in the show. It's still strong with some of its speed intact, with some attacks, but not much. Additionally, it has been cut from the Upside Down, with the Upside Down in the realm simply being a blank darkness that it traverses through. Xenomorph is sort of a similar deal, it's just a greatly nerfed version of the actual Xenomorphs. In the realm they are slower, clunkier, and lack the ability to attack in more strategic ways. They also seem generally weaker and more susceptible to damage. They are still clearly strong and retain abilities, but they have also quite clearly lost a lot too. Blight I actually want to put in greatly nerfed, due to the fact that the serum seems to have much less of an effect on him, and provide less of a boost than it feels it should, with Blight required to use it frequently and after each rush. We even see what Blight should really look like in the True Blight skin. This does make me think that Blight has been nerfed, or his mutating abilities and the serum's power has been stunted for the purpose of keeping him in a fair spot for the trials, forcing him to use this less powerful serum seemingly and stopping him from growing too powerful. That's mostly just speculation though. Equally, Blight's serum could just be his perfected one, so maybe he's just meant to function this way. It just seems a bit wasteful, I suppose. In which case he'd be more in the unchanged or slightly buffed area, I think. Now on to slightly nerfed. Myers was definitely nerfed slightly from his pre-realm self, although despite his embodiment of evil, he never had access to substantial power anyway. He was just a guy with a knife. He did do some strange stuff though, such as basically like teleporting, it seemed. Even though Myers was nerfed, he did still keep a lot that made him powerful, with it instead being reworked into add-ons and things like that. So just a slight nerf for him, I think. A general resistance nerf mostly. Huntress has definitely received a slight nerf to her agility and general speed, I think. In the realm she is much slower and takes her time, where in cutscenes and stuff we see her move incredibly quickly and brutally. She's still incredibly precise and able to launch a hatchet across a whole map, but she's definitely received some notable nerfs to make her fairer for the trials, mainly in the way of speed, I think. Skull Merchant I would debate is in the slightly nerfed category. Beyond the baseline buffs to strength with kicking and stuff like that, Merchant is weaker, I would say. In the realm, her drones in particular are greatly reduced in mobility, having to stay still and much lower to the ground, where before they were high enough that a kite became entangled with them. Merchant outside of the realm I think has much better tracking ability and access to technology, which has been simplified down for the trials. So a technology nerf in this case, I think. Singularity I tend to think has been nerfed somewhat, with him now being restricted to his current form, seemingly unable to improve himself like before, and adapt and grow stronger. The entity wants to keep him in this broken form to remind him of the past more than likely. This is a pretty big restriction, I think, making Hux overall clunkier and slower than he could be, less efficient and so overall nerfed. Unknown is a mysterious character, and so we never really have a definitive idea of the power it's capable of. With this said, I do think it was nerfed slightly in the realm, mostly in the sense of its movement and capability to deceive in the trials being altered and made into something far more simplistic. This isn't that substantial as a nerf to its power, with it still functioning in quite a similar way. Next up we have kept mostly the same. These are characters who I think are pretty similar to their pre-realm selves, only with very small adjustments maybe to certain aspects of them. Trapper seems to have been kept mostly the same within the realm, with the entity not notably buffing or nerfing him. He's still sort of just a guy with bear traps. He likely got some small baseline buffs and some small nerfs like most characters do, but aside this, he doesn't get much change at all. This could be because of his rebellious nature. The entity doesn't want to buff him too much, but equally doesn't want to nerf him, as this is all likely a source of emotion too, leaving him somewhere in the middle. There were lots of votes for overall buffed when I asked you over on Discord, so maybe due to his additional pain resistance and things like that, he could be considered a bit higher here. I don't know, what What do you think? Bubba is pretty much identical to how he appears in Texas Chainsaw. His only changes really lie with the baseline buffs he receives to things like pallet breaking and stuff like that. Otherwise, Bubba is about the same level of power before and when inside of the realm. Pig is another character with very little difference. The main benefit she gets is a more literal stealth factor, with her becoming undetectable when crouching and things like her traps being more abundant in the realm and trials. It could be debated she had slight nerfs with the game being less elaborate, but that's equally debatable. Her goal in the realm when entering it aligns with how she's presented in the trials, so I don't think she had to make much of a sacrifice really for their alteration. Clown is also just basically the same. In fact, the entity probably buffed Maurice more than him. The only big thing I suppose is his ability to just materialize bottles out of nowhere. Otherwise, Clown is essentially the same as before. Deathslinger is quite similar in the realm to how he's presented in his lore. He's maybe a bit slower than before, but this could equally just be because he's older. I do tend to think he's been barely altered by the entity. His slowness could also just be a decision on his part to draw things out and seem more menacing. The entity could have repaired his leg after all, because it can do that, it can replace things and repair different parts of characters, but it made a decision not to, so I think it's intentional. Now onto the buffed characters, the characters who have been empowered. Legion have been buffed in the sense of their blades and damage now inflicting a more powerful effect and wound when they use it. In Frenzy, they become empowered by their newfound freedom and are able to inflict particularly deadly wounds, as well as sprint and vault. Comparatively to before the realm though, this isn't too different from what they could do, and certain add-ons even make reference to this. So overall I would say they were kept about the same. Things like critical damage and stuff like that are things they studied and would know about prior. Deep wounds may just be a manifestation of that. They did of course receive baseline buffs, which are more effective on them than other characters. I will put them in slight here, however, due to their insta-down ability and the effect of increased speed as they chain hits together, which is definitely something they couldn't do before. This increasing speed and the ability to finally insta-down when at that max speed. Billy's primary buff was to his speed. Prior to the realm, he actually injured his leg, which is why he has a limp. However, in the realm, the entity seems to have not only repaired this to some degree, but has further imbued him with a superhuman speed when he uses his chainsaw, allowing him to sprint at high speeds and not be slowed by his damaged leg. Ghostface has received some buffs in the way of being able to insta-down. It seems the entity has taken his meticulousness and ability to study a target and boiled it down into a process where he can do this all in just a few seconds, allowing the insta-down. It doesn't change too much, but does adjust him for the trials and empowers him a bit. I suppose he's also slightly empowered because he has his floaty costume bits. Does that count as a buff? I think that counts as a buff. It's like a style buff, you know. Twins I would consider have been given a slight notable buff from the entity, with Victor now being able to die and come back repeatedly. It does sound powerful as an ability, but in the trials it's not especially. This is all that was really changed with them, making them slightly more effective together and able to set up more complex attacks. Trickster definitely got a slight buff in the form of his main event, where he's able to flurry a bunch of knives out after hitting some, and do so at a much faster speed that is probably impossible for someone to realistically do without an entity buff. Otherwise, Trickster does remain relatively the same, just with this slight speed buff I think. Chucky I do believe is slightly buffed. He's a bit quicker, has his faster dash attack, which seems generally speedier than he can move in the films, and he's just overall more agile I think. He also of course has the baseline buff of being able to break the large pallets. This one's debatable, but I do think the entity has buffed him somewhat. He of course also got the Ghost of Charles to assist him, which is a definite buff and helps him in his smaller form, just having that extra assistance basically. Onto the greatly buffed characters. These are characters with quite notable changes to their power level now that they're in the realm. Artis was just a normal human before she came to the realm, yet in the realm she's been bestowed with substantial power and ability from the entity. Her hands have been returned to her and are even able to form into solid weapons. She's further able to summon her dire crows and has the potential to cause damage with them. This crow guidance and affinity of her prior life being morphed into a power for her. She's a lot more powerful than she used to be, that's for sure. Knight, weirdly, I think has been buffed despite him not really needing it. In the realm, he's still this huge, strong, hulking knight, but now he can further spawn in his guards as these ghost-like assistants he can give orders. That's a pretty good buff to his power level. He maybe doesn't have quite the same movement or ability with his weapons available, but this equally may just be a conscious choice on his part. To me at least, the additional ability of spawning in these roaming guards does put him far more into buff than nerf. Doctor is another character who has received quite a huge buff from the entity, despite appearing and acting relatively the same prior to the realm. The big buff he got is the inexhaustible spark within him that powers his ability and allows him to infinitely shoot out electricity. Quite a big buff, I think. Oni is another quite debatable one, however I think he is deserving of greatly buffed. Sure, he was already an incredibly skilled and deadly samurai, but in the realm he now has supernatural ability and is able to even channel his rage into a tangible power. He's been morphed into an actual Oni, or at least the entity's interpretation of one. He has blue skin, clawed hands, and feet, and is able to let out this otherworldly rage and power once he's collected enough blood. His desire to destroy bloodlines weaker than his becoming an actual and physical force. Finally, the substantially buffed characters who were empowered significantly by the entity. Hag does seem to have received a buff for sure. She technically receives her buff just prior to the trials also, with her empowerment happening when she makes her deal with the entity. This deal seems to transform her into what we see now, with her large claw and greater strength and wielding of the hexes. Before, she was sort of unable to use the hexes effectively or in her favor, but now they seem to have precise effects and whatnot, displaying their power and potential when used properly. Not only was Lisa physically buffed and also repaired likely, but she was further given some harmony with the hexes and the ability to wield them. Quite a huge buff. Wraith was given quite a substantial buff in the realm. His bell in particular was changed and empowered by the entity, with it now able to be rung and completely cloak Philip. This is a pretty powerful effect. Philip also seems generally stronger and faster, able to move with great speed when he is cloaked. His add-ons further open up the possibility of the many alterations and additional effects that can be applied to the bell. Nurse has been buffed greatly, but it's not come without cost. She's been given the realm's strongest power, with her ability to blink through walls and objects, allowing her to briefly enter the spirit world, phasing in and out of the trials. She does this by potentially channeling the life force of Spencer, Pren's warden, who she killed. The only downside to her powers is the intense pain she feels, but this doesn't take away necessarily from the great power it has given her. She's further able to use general telekinesis, with her floating and able to move survivors without touching them in her Mori. Spirit was empowered a lot. She was completely reconstructed for one, and then further given the ability to phase and do things like summon a blade from the shard in her hand. The entity takes Rin from a normal person, and a dying one at that, and turned her into a powerful spirit, this coming at the cost of her new blue skin and her limbs now attached instead by an otherworldly magic. Plague is another character who has been buffed a ton. Before the realm she was dying in a cave from the plague, but now inside of it she's able to wield this plague, and it instead empowers her. She can shoot it out and infect others, and the plague itself even seems faster acting, and she even has a new form of it able to instantly cause damage. This is a huge buff, and likely given as a reward for her loyalty. She's also of course no longer dying from it, she can resist the plague herself. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and be sure to let me know your own thoughts down below. Someone mentioned I stopped saying thanks and goodbye, so thanks and goodbye.